My name is Edwidge Danticat, and this is how I create.
Welcome to This Is How We Create, a show that digs deeper into the creative life of contemporary artists of color. Discover what feeds their creativity and how they found or are finding their artistic voice. Through these intimate and candid conversations, you'll gain insights into the lives of creative professionals of color that are hard to find anywhere else. Welcome back to This Is How We Create. I am your host, Martine Severin. I have a few questions for you on creativity and about what it takes to create. How do you keep yourself motivated with each new project you're taking on? What patterns or process do you have in place to launch you into creating new work? How do you motivate yourself past many failed, well, let's say 5, 10, 50, or 20 failed starts? How do you motivate yourself to get it done after those failed beginnings? If you don't have answers to these questions, don't worry. My guest today, Edwidge Danticat, who is a famous writer, will tell you how she gets it done and how she manages to keep going despite false starts. Edwidge Danticat joins the show to talk about how she became a writer. And as an aside, as a young Haitian girl, reading Edwidge's books inspired me to start thinking about what it takes to create work, whether it is a writer or a photographer. Edwidge shares with us her artistic practice, and I'm so excited for you to listen as well. Edwidge Danticat is the author of several books, including Breath, Eyes, Memory, The Farming Our Bones, and Brother, I'm Dying, which was a National Books Critics Circle winner. She's a two-time winner of the Story Prize and a 2009 MacArthur Fellow, as well as the winner of the Vilcek Prize in 2020. I'm so excited for you to meet Edwidge and to get to know her more. And so let's get to it. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Edwidge.
Thank you so much for having me, Martine.
Well, Edwidge, it's such a pleasure to talk with you. My first introduction to you was through your book, Click and through Breath, Eyes, Memory. For me, growing up in Haiti, my fondest memories were sitting around with my aunties to hear stories that they would tell at night right before we went to sleep. And it was just a wondrous time for me because those oral stories mark my childhood and I think very much influence what I do today. Can you tell me the story of your experience with oral storytelling?
Oh, I loved stories, and I think my love of stories grew from that experience of listening to all storytelling. I was in Haiti with my aunt and uncle. I grew up with them while my parents were in the U.S. And often, we were in a house full of children like us whose parents were elsewhere. And really, when doing moments of storytelling, whether they were in Port-au-Prince where I grew up or in the summers in the countryside, was like the really one of the rare moments where I saw adults like exuding joy when they were telling stories, when they were acting out the characters and singing the songs that came with those stories. So for me, it was a huge influence, really. And when I started writing and started thinking about, aesthetic elements of writing, like when you tell a story, whether you're writing the story or telling the story, pacing, narration, dialogue, suspense, all of that was part of Haitian storytelling. So I often tell people that like my writing teachers were the storytellers of my childhood. And it's true.
I tell my son some of the stories I grew up learning, stories of Buki and Malice, and he finds it hilarious. So can you tell me how hearing those stories and hearing that pacing, dialogue, and suspense that you would hear your family members telling you these stories, how did it first start influencing or indicating to you that you were a writer?
Well, I mean, I wasn't thinking then about the creativity And those stories, I was, when you're young, you're sort of absorbing, you're just taking things in. But when I started reading books, right, the contrast immediately made itself in my mind. I loved reading too because I was shy and I would watch these storytellers and I just thought there's no way I can do that because I wasn't the kind of child who would stand in front of people and recite poems. I was the kind of child that was just always trying to find a corner in which to hide myself. So I looked when I was looking at that presentation when there was like that liveliness, that joy, I was like, I probably couldn't do that. Like I wasn't a performer in that way. But when I was first given a book, and it was Madeleine, like Madeline in the house in Paris that was covered with vines. It was in French, but it was about this little girl in Paris who lived with nuns, and I was living with my aunt and uncle who were older people who looked after all these kids whose parents were away. So when I read that, I thought, oh, this is another way that one can do this storytelling thing, right? That in which you carry the story around with you. I felt that realization when I was about 4 or 5. And I was like, oh, this is cool too, because this person doesn't have to be here while they tell you the story. You can go over it as many times as you want. So for me, when I started reading, when I saw books as an extension of that oral storytelling, which is probably a thing I've taken into my writing life in the sense that I think, oh, I'm telling stories that I've heard, that I hear. I'm a kind of reporter of these types of stories that my characters are telling me.
You leave Haiti, your family moves from Haiti to New York. Can you tell us how you came to submit your first story to 17 magazine?
Well, there were a few steps before 17 magazine. I started writing for a paper. Now it still exists more as a website and some other publications, but it's now Youth Communications, but back then it was New Youth Connections. And it was a publication like that looked like a newspaper. It was a newspaper that was written by high school students and distributed throughout high schools in New York City. So I started writing for them, and one of my first pieces that I wrote for them was about how we celebrate Christmas. Like as in Haiti, my memories of celebrating Christmas in Haiti for me was like on Christmas Eve, staying up all night and then going to see my aunt and uncle my uncle had a store, initially worked at a store and then had his own store in Grand Rue. And then my aunt had a stall where she sold things on Grand Rue. And so Christmas Eve, you could go like really late into the night because they stayed there really late. So visiting them, and then pied d'étoile, sparklers, and getting your sparklers, walking around with your sparklers as a little kid. And then your present was under your pillow, not under a tree. We didn't have a tree in my family. We just did the pillow thing, or under your bed. And so I remember writing my first essay about that, and then writing about coming to the US, like my first day, and being just blown away by the escalator. And so those were my first publications for New Youth Connections. And then once I was writing for them, I wrote for them throughout my whole high school years. And then I submitted one of my stories to that 17 magazine fiction contest. I didn't win, but I got some encouraging feedback from them for my submission, which was the first couple of pages, ended up being the first couple of pages of Breath, Eyes, Memory.
Wow. So your first few pages of Breath, Eyes, Memory, and then you just kept working on it, correct? And even when you went to Brown University. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes. Once I got that bit of encouragement, I was like off like a rock. Because my whole high school life, even though I was writing for New Youth Connections and I knew I wanted to write, my family really, really wanted me to go into medicine. Actually, the high school I was in was Clara Barton High School for the health professions. And I was in a special program called a PEAK program, for kind of like a gifted program that was actually funded by someone to try to get more inner city kids in public school to become doctors. And there was an accelerated program in which I could have left the school. I would have left Clara Barton High School to go to like Xavier or another college where I could go to medical school in 6 years. So a lot of my friends who were in the program with me did that and became medical doctors. But I sort of wanted another path, and so I applied to Barnard College, where I was studying, French literature, that's another way to get exposed to to actually go back to the literature I read when I was in school when I was little, and also just like be able to read as a kind of model, read as a writer, like French in Prose, this book says. And then I was just writing stories, building on that, like that little bit of triumph. I was writing stories before my finals. I would always get ideas for stories when I should have been doing my schoolwork. And then so I kept writing. I wrote a lot of the stories in Creek Crack that way, like out of really bursts of inspiration when I should have been doing something else. And so I kept writing, and I would submit to publications. I submitted to publication contests at my college. And that sort of kept me going on this sort of parallel track of doing the schoolwork, taking my classes, but also writing these stories that I was submitting here and there to small publications.
Edwidge, I think that there are a lot of artists, writers, and such who get so choked with fear around their work. And it sounds like you may or may not have had that dance with fear or with rejection. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, did you ever have any twinges when submitting your work, or how come you kept submitting your work?
Oh, I had that dance with fear. I love how you how you place it, because the element of dance puts a little joy in it. Oh, I still have that dance with fear. And I think at different times, the fear is different, right? So I never so much had the fear of submitting my work, because I always felt like I was initially, when I was submitting, I just felt I'm taking a chance. So, and then I had this other thing. I was like, well, I'm in college, it's not sort of like that huge of a deal if I'm rejected. I would just send my things out. I would do a lot of research to see if it was the right publication. I didn't want to waste my time. And so I would research something. I was like, oh, maybe they might be open to me. So I would do that. The fear for me more came out of through the writing itself, because, I had grown up doing a dictatorship in a family where you were told, like, oh, the words you say can really affect the lives of people around you. So I had a fear about that fear of, while I'm writing things, am I airing dirty laundry? Am I going to make my family look bad? Am I going to make the country look bad? So I had that. I felt those types of fear, of like the fear of suddenly your words are out there in the world. Will people judge you? And so I wrestle with that still. I think if you don't have that kind of trepidation, or that kind of, I wouldn't call it fear necessarily, but if you don't have that questioning, I think it's not important enough if you just don't have like a little pause at times. I mean, there's always ups and downs in writings. There's moments where it's absolute bliss, and then there's just moments where you're like clawing at your fingernails for every word. That's all part of it, I think. And this part of like always this constant reevaluation, this constant questioning, I find is all part of my process. And it's always been from the beginning in that way.
Oh, this is so interesting to me, that clawing. And that's I could see that image. And sometimes it's a little different for me, because as a commercial photographer, when you're on set, we always talk about getting that image. Whenever you're driving down the highway and you see a billboard and it's an image, there's a journey to get to that image. It's never just, you don't take one photo.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it feels really frustrating, even though the client's there and everyone's expecting you to get it. And it's
Mhm.
so interesting for you to talk about that. The process includes moments of joy and then doubt and fear. So all of this, you still experience all of these emotions even now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm working on a. I just started working on a novel now, and I say start because I'm actually typing pages of it, but I have like 20 notebooks of false starts. And just now, when restarted, and it seems to be going okay, and I'm so happy about it that it's going okay. But I realized what was stopping me was this kind of sort of perfectionism that I had developed more in the more recent years, because there's that feeling that other people are, who have read these other things I have written will be looking at this in a particular way. And that really had frozen me with this particular project. As you get a little bit further along, as I've written more, then you have these other concerns. I won't call them fear, concerns of like repeating yourself, of, oh, I'm not in my classroom, in my sort of my room of, as a 20-year-old writing this anymore. So how far have I improved? Am I growing? So all of these, I have all these conversations with myself all the time.
Even while you're going through, the 20 notebooks of false starts, you continue to have conversations with yourself even through each of those editions of those notebooks?
Oh, absolutely. Because, I mean, again, I feel like I finally, this week, broke in this particular project, I feel like, okay, the door is open because I've said to myself, just, just let it be what it is. And then you can work on it later, because I was starting to feel like if I didn't get past this particular project, there were other things behind it that it was keeping me from. So I said to myself, okay, I'm just going to do 1,000 words a day. It's a lot, but for me, because I also was like a binge writer in the past, I had these high expectations for myself, and so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna lower the bar. I'm gonna give myself grace and say I'm just gonna try to do 1,000 pages a day in this, and in 90 days I might have 90,000 words. So sometimes you have to be, I think, in the creative process, especially when you're a bit stalled, you have to be a bit like sort of very practical about it. And that's where I am with this particular work.
Edwidge, this is so surprising to me because you, can I just remind you, you're a MacArthur Genius Grant winner. And I'm like, oh, okay, so it doesn't stop. It just keeps coming.
Yeah, I think every work is new. Like I feel like every project is a new start. It's kind of like you're saying with the images. If they put 20 photographers in the same setting, they each come up with a new version of that, right? What I find that's helpful to me as I go along is to just kind of realize my patterns. Because sometimes we think what you're doing is like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? And then at some point I realize, okay, maybe this is my process. Maybe I'm meant to go crazy a little bit. And then, and every project has its own process, and it just kind of reveals itself to you as you go along.
That was beautiful, Edwidge. I didn't realize that that's what this conversation was going to be about in terms of knowing that everyone has a process and then understanding that that's the process that you have. And this is, you're going to freak out, but it's okay because it's scripted
Yeah.
that you'll
Oh
freak
yeah.
out.
And then, I mean, I think the difference, once you've had a bit of experience, you're like, okay, I've done this before. I can do it. I can do it. And then you have to remind yourself. Sometimes I go back and read things of mine that I really like, and I try to read it as though I were somebody else. And I'm like, hey, I can do it. I can. I'll get there.
Oh, that's perfect. I feel like each of these interviews for the podcast, they're therapy sessions for me. So thank you for helping me along this route. Well, we are coming up to our time, Edwidge, and I just have one last question for you. So
Mhm.
if you could send a short message to yourself, the young girl who had just arrived to the US from Haiti and everything was different and you wanted to reassure that young girl of the future, what would you tell them?
Oh, I would just say what I say to my girls now, even though they have a very, very different type of situation than I did, that, it's going to be okay. Hang in there. Kembela. I think that's what I would say, Kembela. It's going to be okay. And that sounds very, in a way, kind of simple. If you think of what was happening, like when I arrived in the U.S., it was 1981. I mean, kids were getting beaten up at my school for being Haitian. There was the story of AIDS. There was the story, people coming a lot by boat at that time. So it was very tough to be someone arriving beyond all the personal issues of getting to know your parents. But there were a lot of people, because also my parents were people of faith. So there was that whole thing of like surrender. And even though they didn't put it that way themselves, but I mean, just to trust that I would say trust that good people will come in your path and that you'll be okay. And for me, books, that's where really I found solace. Like I found comfort. I read a lot and I was able to lose myself in stories. And a lot of the stories were books about, by Haitian writers like Gigi Dominique, Daniela Ferrière, Marie-Vieux Chauvet, who, because I was transitioning from like reading in French to reading in English, I would go to the library to the Haitian section. They had these novels in French that I just devoured as a way of going home. And then I started reading writers like Maya Angelou, who also had little girl left behind stories to tell. I was really surprised to learn. I was like, oh my gosh, this going to, with grandmas and going down south, it was like going to the countryside, for us. And so I would say definitely hang in there and also seek out those stories, seek out those commonalities, read, if at all possible, and just try to see where your world and your life extends and meets another life. And I think literature does that so beautifully and so powerfully. The arts in general. So that's what I would say. And that's what I say to my girls all the time as they roll their eyes.
It's really great advice, but I could see how a teenager would definitely roll their eyes. Oh, Edwidge, this conversation has been so amazing. I think the last time I saw you was when you came to Wellesley College, I think in 2019 or 2020. No, 2021 maybe. I don't know. It was a long time
Oh,
ago.
it was a long time ago.
That was a
You were
long
saying,
time.
yeah, it was. I remember it, but it was a while back. Yeah,
That was a while back. And so I
yeah.
am just as pleased to have spent a bit of time with you. I am so pleased to have kept up with your career and to see all the wonderful things that you've done. And I devoured all of your books as well as the essays that you have edited. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Oh, thank you very much. It's wonderful chatting with you. All
That's
right.
it.
All
Oh, wait, were
right.
you going to say one more thing?
Oh no, I was going to say feel better, but I didn't know if I should say it on a podcast.
Oh, people will hear that I'm all nasaled.
All right. Well, feel
Oh,
better. You know what we did when we had it? We did a lot of sort of natural anti-inflammatory things like ginger, turmeric. Like we would do like this kind of orange juice, ginger, ground ginger. Just like things that not some natural things to help you along.